So again, from southeastern Finland in Northern Europe. On June the 26th, 1944, the Finnish president, Mr. Risto Ryti, signed an agreement, which was actually just an informal personal commitment in the form of a German language letter that he had addressed to the Nazi Adolf Hitler, according to which as long as Ryti was in office as the Finnish president, neither he nor the Finnish government would initiate separate peace negotiations with the Soviet Union without Germany's approval. So the general situation was that Germany was being attacked from the west, the east, and the south. Germany had already lost much of its territories in Eastern Europe, and basically the Soviet armies were just or had just begun 4 days earlier a major offensive to retake fully the Eastern European territories that Germany had conquered, starting ironically 3 years earlier on June the 22nd, 1941. Finland had had a somewhat uneasy, informal military alliance called Brotherhood in Arms or co-belligerency with Germany. It had only signed the so-called anti-Comintern agreement, an agreement whereby Finland committed itself to oppose the Comintern or the Alliance of International Communist Parties, centered in Moscow, the Soviet Union. But until then, Finland had formed any kind of formal military treaty, or had not signed any kind of formal military treaty with Germany that would have resembled its Germany's so-called Pact of Steel, which it had signed with Italy in May 1939, or its defense alliance with Japan. Finland had remained, for all practical purposes, under the circumstances, a fairly democratic country. Of course, the wartime censorship had reduced the amount of available information, not just to the members of the public, but also to the members of parliament, compared to the peacetime period. But then again, war censorship was in effect in all democracies which were fighting or somehow involved in the Second World War, including the United States, Canada, and Britain. So that was hardly unique. Finland had refused in most cases to hand over Jewish refugees staying in Finland. The most publicized and probably the saddest exception to this rule having occurred in November 1942, when, according to the traditional accounts, 8 Jewish refugees had been forced, although 2 of them had boarded voluntarily, 1 woman and her child, and then those 6 men had been forced to be deported from Finland, then through the German-occupied Baltic countries and Eastern Europe into the Auschwitz death camp, where, according to the traditional historical accounts, 7 of those 8 Jewish refugees had been killed. Now we know, fortunately, that at least tens, possibly even hundreds of Jewish refugees. It is difficult to ascertain that. These estimates are based on a book called The Surrendered Ones, or The Handed Over Ones, written by Ms. Elina Sana, a Finnish journalist. And this is based on the contemporary accounts and then on those deported individuals' names, especially last names, but to some extent first names as well. We don't know the exact number, but not a single Jew who was of Finnish Jewish descent was handed over to Germany by the Finnish authorities. The Finnish government was divided over the issue because the Interior Minister, Mr. Toivo Horelli, who, according to his portfolio, was responsible for these deportations, was a strongly pro-German politician of the then conservative National Coalition Party, while Finance Minister or Trade and Industry Minister, Mr. Väinö Tanner, and then Social Affairs Minister, Mr. Karl August Fagerholm, both Social Democrats, were strongly opposed to the deportation of these Jewish refugees. And then false accusations were made against them, according to which they had supposedly knowingly broken the Finnish law while living in Finland and therefore supposedly deserved to be handed over. Well, in any case, Germany had at times cut off or delayed its shipments of weapons and or other war materials and grain in short supply because of the virtual standstill of international trade to Finland in order to pressure it to a closer relationship with itself. The Finnish politicians mostly were realists, however, and already starting with the disastrous defeat of Germany at the Battle of Stalingrad, which had ended at the end of January 1943, most Finnish politicians already realistically concluded that Germany would lose the Second World War and that Finland had better condition itself for another unfavorable peace treaty with the Soviet Union following the March 1940 peace treaty, which had ended the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, where Finland had surrendered over 10% or so of its territory, including most of the historical province of Karelia, to the Soviet Union. And the so-called peace opposition, at that time composed officially of 33 members out of 200, that is 1/6 of the Finnish parliamentarians, had already in August 1943 sent an open letter addressed to the Finnish president, Mr. Risto Ryti, demanding that the president start seriously seeking peace opportunities in negotiations with the Soviet Union. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, the siege of Leningrad, which had lasted for over 2 years, was finally broken, and that meant that Germany had lost already also in the northwestern part of what was then the Soviet Union, the Eastern Front fighting of the Second World War. And since Germany had to start retreating also in the Baltics and Eastern Europe, it was only a matter of time when Germany would lose its stronghold of Estonia on the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland, the eastern arm of the Baltic Sea, and therefore would be incapable of defending Finland from the south. And by the time the Normandy invasion began in northwestern France in June 1944, it was clear that Germany would soon become unable to defend Finland militarily, because it would have to concentrate on defending eventually its own territory. So, to put a long story short, on June the 9th, 1944, began in the morning, local time, a huge barrage of artillery fire and air bombardment against the Finnish positions, which were then situated slightly inside what was the Soviet territory in the southern part of the Karelian Isthmus, a narrow land region between the Gulf of Finland in the west and Lake Ladoga in the east. Already on June the 10th, 1944, the second day of the invasion, the Finnish front line was broken. And on June the 20th, 1944, with relatively little resistance, the Soviets already captured the city of Viipuri, the classical capital of the historical province of Karelia, and according to different statistics, either the second or the fourth largest Finnish city before the Second World War. Already on June the 14th, when the second defensive line had been breached at Kuuterselkä in the interior of the Karelian Isthmus, the Finnish Army's Chief of Staff or Commander, Marshal of Finland, Mr. Gustaf Mannerheim, had issued a daily order to empty East Karelia of Finnish soldiers in order to ease the pressure on them in the Karelian Isthmus. So on June the 22nd, 1944, rather surprisingly, just like 2 years earlier, when the Nazi German dictator Adolf Hitler had basically invited himself as a guest to the 75th anniversary or birthday celebration of Marshal Mannerheim, the German foreign minister, Mr. Joachim von Ribbentrop, flew from Germany to Helsinki, Finland, and then started a 4-day series of negotiations with the Finnish president, Mr. Risto Ryti, in order to persuade him to sign effectively a military alliance that would bind Finland to Germany for the duration of the Second World War in Europe. After negotiating about the matter with some cabinet ministers and constitutional experts, President Ryti decided to conclude an informal agreement at his own risk, without having the commitment approved either by the Finnish cabinet, at least some, if not several, of whose members, cabinet ministers, opposed it, more or less, or the Finnish parliament, where it probably would not have received a majority in a free and fair vote. So he made this commitment at his own risk in order to get badly needed weapons and bullets and grain from Germany, and in order to absolve his successor of political responsibility, because according to the constitutional scholars, this kind of informal agreement could be overturned by President Ryti's successor. Apparently, no one in the German political and military command dared to remind the already unpredictable and increasingly mentally unbalanced Führer or dictator Adolf Hitler of the fact of two facts. First, that President Ryti's second term as the Finnish president would end already in March 1945, and second, that the Finnish constitution allowed the president to step down before the end of his term, as Ryti's predecessor, the late President Kyösti Kallio, had already done in November 1940, effective then at his death in December 1940, on the same day as Ryti had been elected as his successor. Finland did receive some military aid, and actually the first contingent of that military aid, the flight squadron Kuulmai, had already arrived to Finland and had helped to a significant extent the wavering Finnish defenders of the Karelian Isthmus. That military aid had come too late to save Viipuri from Soviet occupation, but then during the course of the next several weeks, the Finnish land front stabilized in the northwestern corner and northern part of the Karelian Isthmus, following the defensive victories in the battles of Tali-Ihantala to the north and northeast of Viipuri, and then in Äyräpää on the northern shore of the Vuoksi River. in late June and in July 1944, and then in northern Karelia in late July and early August 1944, Finland was able to prevent the Soviets from breaching the inner line of defenses, the so-called Salpa or Bolt line in Ilomantsi, Finland's currently easternmost town in northern Karelia. And therefore, for the last several weeks of the last slightly over 3 weeks of the continuation war, before the armistice became effective on the Finnish side on September the 4th, 1944, and on the Soviet side of the front line on September the 5th, 1944, there were no other significant land battles. By that time, Finland already had a new president and had broken off the diplomatic relations with Germany, because President Ryti, citing the need to combine the Finnish political and military leadership in plain English in order to create conditions more favorable for a negotiated peace treaty with the Soviet Union, have under a new president who would not have compromised himself politically as much as Ryti had been forced to do, which must have been mentally a difficult decision for him, because he was a firm believer in liberal democracy. He was a great admirer of the British and American political, social, and economic systems and cultures. But because of the unfortunate circumstances which threw Finland to the opposite side of the conflict in Northern Europe, to the two countries whose friendship it would have wanted to maintain during the Second World War, Britain and the United States, because Britain and the United States happened to be allied with Finland's main enemy, the Soviet Union, and then Finland, unfortunately, happened to be allied, albeit informally, with the Soviet Union's, Britain's, and the United States' main enemy, Germany. And then Ryti also reluctantly referred to the decline of his personal health or physical health when he tendered his resignation as the Finnish president on August the 1st, 1944. This paved the way to Marshal Mannerheim's unanimous election through a special law or emergency law by the Finnish parliament already on August the 4th, 1944. Approximately 4 weeks later, on September the 2nd, 1944, the Finnish president, cabinet, and parliament approved the severing or breaking off of diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany. And then the armistice came into effect on the Soviet side of the Eastern Front on September the 5th. Then on the evening of September the 6th, 1944, the Finnish peace delegation led by the Prime Minister or head of government, Mr. Antti Haktzel, left Helsinki by train and then crossed the armistice line at Juustila to the north of Viipuri on September the 7th and continued its journey to Moscow, where finally on September the 14th, 1944, the peace negotiations were begun. And on September the 19th, 1944, a new, rather harsh peace treaty was concluded between Finland and the Soviet Union, restoring, with only a couple of exceptions, the borders that had already been agreed upon 4.5 years earlier in March 1940. The two exceptions were that the Hanko military base was exchanged for a more eastern military base, the Porkkala military base, which at its easternmost point was only located some 19 kilometers or 12 miles to the west of the Helsinki center. And then in the far north, the Petsamo or Petsenga area, which had given Finland the so-called second arm and an ice-free port on the southern shore of the Arctic Ocean, was surrendered to the Soviet Union. Later in 1947, Finland sold a tiny portion of northern Lapland, the Jäniskoski-Niskakoski Rapids area, as a part of the Paris Peace Treaty, which formally concluded the series of treaties after the Second World War. Former President Ryti, along with 7 other former top politicians, one of them actually the the Finnish ambassador to Nazi Germany during the Continuation War, were arrested in November 1945, sorry, and then in February 1946, the sentences were passed on them some days after apparently Mr. Savonenkov, one of the leading Soviet members of the so-called Allied Control Commission, a basically Soviet-dominated body with only a few British members, which wanted to force Finland into a closer relationship with the Soviet Union and make sure that Finland would be politically also humiliated. Anyway, at first, the special court or so-called state court or court of impeachment had decided to free from the charges of abusing his office for the harm of the state. Mr. Toivo Kivimäki, a former prime minister of Finland, who between 1940 and 1944 had served as the Finnish ambassador to Nazi Germany, and that the 7 other accused men would have been sentenced to between 2 and 8 years of imprisonment. An informal note which claimed that 5 of the 8 accused former top politicians actually would have deserved death penalty, and then they were listed: former President Ryti, former Finance Minister or Trade and Industry Minister Mr. Väinö Tanner, a leading Finnish Social Democrat, former Assistant Finance Minister Mr. Tyko Reinikka, former Prime Minister Edwin Linkomies, who had served for a long time as the professor of Roman literature and then as the assistant rector or assistant principal of the Helsinki University, former Prime Minister Johan or Jukka Rangel, notably close friend of former President Ryti, former Foreign Minister Henrik Ramsay, who was of Scottish descent, and then former Education Minister Mr. Antti Kukkonen. I'm sorry, I got mixed up. So Ryti, Linkomies, Rangel, Tanner and Kivimäki, they would have supposedly deserved, according to this informal note, the death penalty, while former Foreign Minister Ramsay, former Assistant Finance Minister Reinikka, and former Education Minister Kukkonen would be given more lenient sentences. In the cases of the 5 supposedly more guilty politicians, the Allied Control Commission was satisfied with imprisonments ranging from 5 to 10 years. And so on February the 21st, 1946, the pressured Court of Impeachment or State Tribunal handed down the following sentences. Former President Ryti was sentenced to 10 years penitentiary. Former Prime Minister Rangel to 6 years imprisonment. Former Prime Minister Linkomies and former Finance Minister or Trade and Industry Minister Tanner were sentenced to 5.5 years imprisonment. Former ambassador Kivimäki was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Former foreign minister Ramsey to 2.5 years imprisonment, and then former assistant finance minister and former Reinikka and former education minister Kukkonen to 2 years imprisonment. In 1945, then President and Marshal Gustav Mannerheim, when he was being interviewed by Mr. Kustaa Vilkuna, who had been I think the chairman of the Finnish military intelligence, and would later serve as a famous ethnologist and academician, and as a close gray eminence behind Finland's longest-serving president, Mr. Urho Kekkonen. Then President Mannerheim told him that he admired his predecessor Ryti's act of civic courage. So the Ryti-Ribbentrop agreement was an informal one. It was an ad hoc agreement in the sense that the Finnish president did not even imagine that it would be kept for a long time, but Finland desperately needed military aid at the time, and therefore the agreement was concluded, although it cost, for example, President Ryti his political career.